Please allow me to acknowledge the distinguished guests. His Eminence, Archbishop Dimitrios, former Ageron of America, the Very Reverend Archimandrite Nectarios Papazafiropoulos, Chancellor of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, representing Archbishop Elpidophoros, who could not be with us tonight. Honorable Rabbi David Levy, head of the American Jewish Committee of New Jersey, representing David Harris, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Jewish Committee, who also cannot be with us tonight. Professor Mark Mazauer of Columbia University, tonight's keynote speaker. The Honorable Rabbi Diana Gerson, Associate Executive Vice President of the New York Board of Rabbis. His Excellency Ambassador Mr. Asaf Zamir, the Council of Israel. His Excellency Ambassador Mr. Paul Steinmetz, the Consul General of Luxembourg. Her Excellency Ambassador Ifigenia Kondoleondos, Permanent Observer for the international organization, the Francophonie at the United Nations. Honorable Consul General of Cyprus, Mr. Michalis Firilas. The Honorable Madeline Singas, Judge of the New York Court of Appeals. The Honorable Deputy Consul General of Italy, Mr. Cesare Bieler. The Honorable Deputy Commissioner of International Affairs of New York City, Mrs. Kristen Kaufman. The Honorable Consul of Greece, Mr. Dimitrios Papayoriou. The President of the American Friends of the Jewish Museum of Greece, Mr. Solomon Asser. Professor Catherine Fleming, Provost of New York University. Mr. Vasilis Tsamis, Chief Administrative Officer of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. Ms. Nancy Papaioannou, President of the Atlantic Bank. Mr. Andrew Marcus, Director of Kehila Kedosha Janina, the only Greek Jewish Romanot synagogue and museum in New York, and indeed, I believe, the Western Hemisphere. And finally, Mr. Athasioannou, President of the Hellenic American Chamber of Commerce. Welcome all. We are happy that you could join us. If you notice in the program, Mr. Andreas Katsaniotis, who is the Deputy Minister for Greeks Abroad, is listed as a speaker tonight because of the situation currently that we're all so upset about. He was not able to join us this evening, but he has sent us a video.
Good evening. Before I begin, I ask that we turn our thoughts to the people of Ukraine. To the people of Ukraine fighting for their home and their very survival against the relentless assault of heinous aggressor. Please, let us observe a moment of silence for the victims of this latest illegal invasion. Please, guys. Please take your seats. For much of known history, the Jews were strangers. And because the laws of hospitality apply to strangers only until they unpack, 4 generations ago, our world grew claws and fangs. And it said, where something is, there shall be nothing. And it adorned children's threadbare coats with stars, meant as badges of inferiority. And it said, the only way out of here is through the chimney. But the trains, the camps, we now know were not a beginning. And we know now they were not an end. Distinguished guests, it is very hard to speak intelligently, let alone eloquently, on this very day. How are we to honor those who, in an instant, were no more? But honor them we must, for we owe a debt to the dead, that they shall be remembered. We owe a debt of gratitude to the survivors, for they hold a mirror before our faces, and in it we see our world. Distinguished guests, today, ignorance is a duty, and hating other people is fun. Today, much of this world knows nothing. Some of it knows less than nothing. Less than nothing. Today, our world seems to have mastered oblivion and to be manufacturing contempt. Riven between ignorance and bias, between apathy and zealotry, overt hostility has again become commonplace. Today, which feels like cruelty, might be a feature, not a bug of a human condition. And we wring our hands and look to the skies. And we turn to each other in this belief, maybe. We do know, we cannot cure what is wrong with our world by fiat. How do we weather this resilient wave of aggression? Do we slink away? Do we take charge? Do we posture? Do we flee? What new perspectives must we find? What new interpretation shall we seek? But we still can make our world different from theirs. We can do it. And we shall honor the fallen by making this world so. Thank heavens with our strength in each other and our moral stance rooted in remembrance. We shall honor the fallen as we walk on, and we shall stand for those who cannot stand for themselves. We shall stand for those who are not like ourselves. We shall correct the errata of intolerance, one swift stroke at a time. We shall take exception, and yes, if need be, we shall take offense. By walking on for humanity and for history and for memory. For we are all of us, of every color, and every creed. We are all of us. Every single one of us. We are strangers. Strangers. Strangers who walk alone, who walk together, who walk tall during the day, so we lie in peace during the night. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Solomon Asser, is the president of the American Friends of the Jewish Museum of Greece. He has devoted many years of his life to effective work in support of Jewish causes. I'm pleased to present to you Solomon Asser.
I want to welcome you all, especially Archbishop Dimitrios, Your Excellency, Archimandritis, Rabbis Levy, Rabbi Gerson, all of you consul generals from all the countries that you took the time to come over tonight. I want to thank the Consul General, I want to thank Consul General Koutras because since he came to this city, he took the topic of the Holocaust Remembrance in his heart. And he strived every year to make this event more important, and filling this room with people like you. And last year we reached all over the world with the help of the virus and the Zoom calls. His dedication on this event has been amazing, and I really thank you from the bottom of my heart. Also, I want to thank our sponsors tonight, the Atlantic Bank with Nancy Papaioannou and Vasilis Tsamis from the Niarchos Foundation for their generous participation on this night's event. I'm the president of the American Friends of the Jewish Museum in Greece, a museum that was organized 46 years ago from friends of my parents on the back of the synagogue in Athens, because some Bulgarian remains of Jews were found, and they were brought to Greece, and they didn't know what to do with them. And then they created a room on the back of the synagogue that they called it the museum. And as the years go by, the museum had more and more memorabilia, art, stories, documents that they were collecting. And it moved from one location to another, and in the early 2000s, he got his own home on Nikki Street. When I was asked to become president of this American Friends, I was surprised because I was never extremely religious or concerned about the topic, even though I grew up in a home that both my parents were saved by Christian Jews, by Christian Greeks. And it was a quiet topic. The only time that we were talking about it is around Christmas time, that we were going and visit Theo Costa and Thea Olga, and it was always, how come they have Christian names and they're our relatives? And little by little we learned the story. That was the family that my father and his brother was hiding. And in 1996, my mother was keeping a diary as she was in hiding in Salonika, being the only family in hiding in the city. And she published her diary, and that was in 1996. And I read the book, And I understood things like, I understood how her mind was working, her reactions during our childhood was. I vividly remember in 1967 when the colonels took over the Athens, and I was a child, and I was looking out the windows, and I was seeing tanks going by the street, and I was curious. Oh, tanks! Let's go and play. And everybody was saying, and my mother comes to me and says, you have to be quiet. Says, because this reminds us of the occupation. And as the year go by, my parents, the friends, my uncles, my aunts, start feeling the need to tell their story. Because they didn't want to remember the unhuman times that they went through. Greece has been a place where the Jews have been for almost before Jesus Christ, like 2,400 years ago. It was the first diaspora community living in Egypt. And they were totally assimilated. Dr. Matzes wrote a book under the name of Illusion of Safety, and his second book came about not long ago. And the Greeks were feeling so comfortable in Greece because they never experienced the pogroms the Eastern Europeans experienced. In ancient Athens, there was the word metikos, which means a green card holder. And most of the Jews, they were green card holders in the ancient Athens. The museum, from being just a museum holding memorabilia and documents and art, has changed its course and dedicated itself to teach the existence of Jews in the Greek soil and teach the Holocaust. It's teaching the Holocaust to the teachers who by their turn teach it to the students. Organizes every year trips to Auschwitz. Every April, with the exception of the last 2 years, the trips that are organized that Greek Christian children go and visit the horrible site. And they come back and tell to their friends, the students, and it's not everybody who goes. They have to take an exam, and depending on the writing, they manage to go on the trip or not. The Greek state has been commemorating the Holocaust Remembrance Day since it was adopted by the European Union. Every year, that's the Holocaust Memorial in Athens, and every year the presidents go and honor the dead. Here's the current president, Katerini Sakelloropoulou, at the Holocaust Memorial on January 27. I can't tell you how important it is to help the museum continue its work and spread the news and the existence of Greek Jewry. Organizes exhibits, and next week is going to be an exhibit by the name of Good Shepherds, which will be presented in the Maliotis Center in Boston, which shows all the clerics and rabbis who helped the Jews to be around these days. And the exhibit was inspired by the president of the museum, Makis Matzas, who also was saved by Greek priests. As the years go by, the survivors disappear. I think we have few survivors sitting in the room tonight. I would like to ask them to sit up. Why not? I guess they're humble enough not to. The thing is, they're going, and we are only ones to carry what happened. And we have to keep doing these events, bring our memories to surface. And I want to wish that every human being who perished because of its religion and race and color be remembered tonight. Wish a brighter future to all of us. Thank you.
I'm pleased to welcome to the podium the Consul General of Israel in New York, His Excellency Ambassador Mr. Asaf Zamir.
Good evening, distinguished guests. I'm new in this city, so I'm not expected to remember all the names of the important people here. This is the last year I can just say distinguished guests and get away with it. So distinguished guests, thank you for having me this evening. I'm very honored to be here. I also have a speech written, which is a formal speech the Consul General of Israel should say at an event like this, but I was inspired by Mr. Asher's heartfelt words, and I thought I'd rather address this event as an Israeli and not as the Consul General. And just to speak my mind, when you grow up in Israel, it's very hard to imagine how the rest of the world commemorates the Holocaust. It's unthinkable or unimaginable that the Greek Consulate and the Greek Jewish American community, or the Greek community in America, commemorates the Holocaust the 18th year. It's such a respectable event like this. It's heartwarming as an Israeli. I want to say thank you to everyone that's here. We use the phrase never again. Growing up, you believe it really will be never again. You look at the world, the places it's going. It's hard to imagine something so horrific could ever happen. I have a speech about Archbishop Damaskinos, who saved thousands of Jewish lives and was awarded the Righteous Among the Nations award by Yad Vashem, one of 361 Greeks awarded this highest of honors from the Israeli people. And to acknowledge the understanding of the bond between Greece and Israel, the understanding that if something like this were ever to happen again, we would have each other's backs. But truly feeling this could never happen. And I came to the United States almost 5 months ago and started meeting people and reading social media and visiting on campuses and meeting young Jews. And I was shocked. I was shocked by the level of anti-Semitism in all of its new forms that exists today. By the way, in every side of politics, in very smart and disturbing ways, in costume sometimes, in anti-Zionist rhetoric. I think if a lot of people in this room were asked just a month ago if they could imagine that what's happening right now in the Ukraine could happen, most people would say that sounds too far off. It would never happen again. Never again. you see both of these things I just talked about and understand that we live in a much more fragile world than I grew up thinking we live in, and in a much less stable world. And to be honest, because it exists in many countries, it's not a matter of West versus East. It's a matter of good and bad. And the war on the narrative of what is good and what is bad will be an ongoing war forever. And the job of everyone in this room is to remind ourselves that our biggest challenge is a younger generation, that this room is filled with amazing people, but very few of them are from the very younger generation. And as my friend the consul said, when you talk to younger people, they sometimes know nothing. The ideas sometimes are twisted, and the history sometimes is twisted. And that is used by people who want bad things. So sadly I say, we still have to say, never again. We still have to teach. We still have to fight. We have to fight to make sure everyone adopts what we call the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which links modern-day anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism, which allows people, not just Jews, to practice their beliefs, to practice their religion and their traditions, and something we all thought was a given, but it's not. So I happily and sadly hope to see you all here next year, to keep on remembering, to keep on reminding ourselves that never again. I'm sure I will be here. And I'm sure the bond between Israel and Greece, and American Greek people in Israel, and American Jewish Greek people in Israel, will keep on, will grow and become stronger as an alliance of good, protecting from the bad. Thank you very much.
Allow me to present our next speaker, the Honorable Consul General of Cyprus in New York, Mr. Michalis Frilas.
Yeah, you should leave that behind. Thank you. Dear guests, I was humbled when my friend Konstantinos asked me to address you, and I'm deeply honored to be here at this beautiful event, this beautiful site, and also to be following the comments of my colleague and friend Asaf. When I asked Konstantinos why he thought I should speak, he said that, well, of all people, you have probably the longest relationship with Israel, and a very personal relationship, and that made me think that I wanted to share with you something that I had written about how I've come to understand the Holocaust. And I wrote this back in 2008 in a piece that was published. I was working at the time as one of the editors of Haaretz, the Israeli daily, and it was a piece that 14 years ago, almost to the day, it was published on the 30th of April. It was right around the time of Yom HaShoah in Israel, and I wanted to share it with you because it's personal, and I think it's very appropriate. I should tell you that for the past 43 years, I've had a very intimate personal relationship with Israel. I arrived as the son of a diplomat at the age of 10, and I've been married to an Israeli woman for the past 26 years. We have 2 sons. My mother-in-law's family perished in the Holocaust. So as the years went by, this whole subject became about as personal as one can feel it. So with your permission, although I was given 100 seconds to speak, I will read these 3 paragraphs, and I hope you understand where I'm coming from. The real change for me, when I began to put it all together, the horror, the enormity, the narratives, the inhumanity, and the perseverance, happened when I went to the neighborhood store one day. The owner, a nice little old man who looked a bit like Yoda, Mr. Katz was his name, normally had long-sleeved shirts on. One summer day, even he succumbed to the heat wave. A barely discernible smudge on his arm, somewhere in the wrinkled old skin, stood out as he reached out to give me my change. Mesmerized, I stared and realized it was a number. To me, that number came to symbolize the uniqueness of the Holocaust. It was no longer just genocide. It was something else, something for which I'm still short of words. In retrospect, I think that the number on the arm of Mr. Katz shocked me because it made him definitively unheroic. It stripped him of his identity, of his individualism as a human being. It encapsulated everything that organized extermination was about. The sort of killing that targets people without pathos, without feeling or afterthought. A mechanical, calculated massacre with a kind of distance between victim and perpetrator that makes it seem almost banal. Over the years, I've come to understand the Holocaust better. And the more I realized that there are many out there who still do not fathom its horror, its uniqueness, and its significance. The vitriol, the hatred, the ignorance of the sort uttered regularly, the raw anti-Semitism that is often echoed around the world, has led me to draw a red line. So long as there are those out there dreaming of another Holocaust, I know whose side I'm on. Lo nishkach. Thank you.
Over the past few years, Rabbi Diana Gerson has become a most welcome and inspiring presence in our Holocaust Remembrance programs. She is Associate Executive Vice President of the New York Board of Rabbis and has distinguished herself as a recognized authority on the prevention of family violence and the exploitation of children. As I've said in previous years, I've always added that she's also a Philhellene. You know I had to mention it, Rabbi. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Rabbi Diana Gerson.
We also found out I'm a quarter Romagnot, so more than just a Philhellene. Your Eminence, Your Excellencies, honored guests, I am both honored and humbled to be here tonight because we have gathered together for a few different reasons. One, we have come together as a community. We have so long yearned to be together. The last 2 years, we have been so physically far apart and yet so spiritually connected. Last year, seeing so many of us on the Zoom of Remembrance and knowing how it reached around the world with over 10,000 views, we know not only is the power of community present, whether you're in person or you're online, but the need to remember is such a tangible part of who we are as a human family. We've also come together to reflect and to remember and to remind the future generations of what our ancestors experienced, our family, our friends, the communities that we hold dear. I have been asked in particular to come tonight to frame that remembrance in our Jewish tradition. At this hour of memorial, we recall with grief all of God's children who have perished through the cruelty of the oppressor, victims of demonic hate, the aged and young, the learned and the unlettered, all driven in multitudes along the road of pain. Lives cut short. During the sacred gathering of remembrance, let us call to mind our loved ones, our neighbors, our friends, who were great and good. They were kind and loving in their deeds. The goodness of their lives will never be lost, and their work cannot be blotted out. Adonai, our God, bless the memories that we cherish.
Tonight's keynote speaker is a distinguished historian, Dr. Mark Mazauer. He is Ira D. Wallach Professor of History at Columbia University, where he also serves as the founding director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination, which promotes discourse among scholars, leading artists, writers, composers, and film directors. His special interest is in international history, with a focus on 20th century Europe and Greece in particular. He has written about Hitler's empire as well as the German occupation of Greece. It is indeed a special honor to present to you Dr. Mark Mazauer.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to express my thanks to our hosts at the Hebrew Union College and to the Consul General of Greece in New York, my friend Konstantinos Koutras, for the invitation to speak to you on such a solemn occasion, one rendered all the more so by the events occurring in these days in the Ukraine, which surely makes us pause and reflect once again on the past and its importance. We're here tonight to honor the Jews of Greece and to commemorate their suffering in the Second World War. For some of you, the story will be grimly familiar. For others, perhaps, the Jewish communities of Greece and their long and rich history are relatively unknown, for it's true that they occupy a fairly marginal place in most surveys of the Jewish experience. It's a subject, however, that's preoccupied me for many years. I vividly remember my first visit to Thessaloniki back in 1981. Molcho's bookshop was still in the old premises, a fixture of foreign language books, news, and learning from Europe that had been there for nearly a century. Inside, I met Solomon and René. I have two stories about them. They told me how they'd survived the German occupation. If memory serves, it was on Skopelos, I may have that wrong, where the peasants who protected them were so unused to encountering a real live Jew that they would ask them, "You Jews, how do you make the sign of the cross?" The other thing I remember is that they asked me where I was from. "Apotin Anglia," I said, "from England." "Ochi, Apopu, where are you really from?" "Apotin Polonia, Russia, Ashkenazi, man. I'm Ashkenazi from Thimpirazi." That's when I first heard the authentic voice of Salonican Sephardic aristocratic Jewry. I relished the moment. In the Anopolis, houses dating back to Ottoman times were crumbling. In the courtyard of Ois Dimitrios, one could see the marble tombstones with the Hebrew lettering. I didn't then know why. Some years later, I was doing some research in Athens when I was invited into the Ministry of Justice. It was the time of the Waldheim affair, and he had spent a lot of the war as an intelligence officer in Greece. The TV company had sent me there to see what I could find on his years of service in Thessaloniki. When I got there, the World Jewish Congress had asked the Greek government to sift through their archives for what they might have that was pertinent to the case. And there in the ministry basement, I was shown 2 or 3 enormous sacks stuffed with documents and covered with dust. "This is what we found from the war," I was told. "Do you really want to open them? You'll get terribly dirty." Well, I took off my jacket, and I guess I was the first person to have looked inside them since the end of the war. Out came hundreds of pieces of paper, documents, slips, official chits. It was the work of a moment to establish what they were. They were the records of the so-called Service for the Administration of Jewish Property that had been set up in the spring of 1943 to manage hundreds of shops and dwellings that were being vacated by Thessaloniki's Jews as they were rounded up, sent into the ghettos, and then onwards by train to Auschwitz. In those days, little work, almost none, was being done on the history of the Jews of Greece, especially during the Holocaust. The Jewish Museum of Greece had been founded a few years before. I remember meeting Nikos Stavroulakis there. But the interests of Greek historians lay elsewhere. The memory of the civil war was fresh, and the Greek public remained largely ignorant and indifferent. More than 30 years have elapsed since then, and that picture has changed very dramatically. Our gathering here this evening testifies eloquently to this. More generally, there's been an outpouring of interest in virtually every sector of society. Survivors' memoirs have been published in Greek. There have been art exhibitions, theatre performances, concerts and readings. 2 generations of younger scholars have produced truly outstanding work. We have a serious scholarly account of the history of the Jews of Greece. Its author is with us this evening. And new research is being conducted all the time and published in many languages. The topic is not regarded as a minority interest, but prompts the attention and engagement of some of the most talented young scholars in Greece today. This is not the occasion to explore this extraordinary outpouring with you, fascinating though it is. Instead, I want to begin with a single date and work outward from there. So let us take us back to the most decisive month in the most decisive year in the fate of Greek Jewry, March 1943. In New York, it was announced that canned goods were being rationed for the first time. The impact of America's entry into the war was beginning to hit home. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Allied air power bombed a Japanese troop convoy with massive loss of life, effectively ending the threat to Australia. On the Eastern Front, where the German Sixth Army had just been wiped out at Stalingrad, the Red Army was already pushing the Wehrmacht back into the Ukraine, while Soviet partisans carried out attacks in the German rear. It was after one of these attacks that German SS troops surrounded the small Ukrainian town of Kryukivka to the east of Cherniv on March the 1st and massacred more than 6,000 people. The story is no doubt unknown to you, as it was to me, because dozens, if not hundreds, of such atrocities took part in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia itself in those years. But this was killing on an enormous scale, one of the very largest such punitive operations the Germans ever carried out. And in Greece? That spring, a 21-year-old Jewish boy from Thessaloniki, Maurice Saltiel, was living in Athens studying economics at the university. He had reached it disguised as a railway worker, coming from home, where his parents were more or less trapped. He had 2 close Christian friends from high school, Sotiris Faltsis and Yannis Triantifilidis, and Faltsis' grandmother lived in the Greek capital. Maurice Saltiel thus found refuge with her, while his friends remained in close contact with his parents. Maurice and his mother, Sarina, began writing letters to one another. His have been lost. But Saltiel, who survived the war, kept his mother's letters in an old folder as a family heirloom, and they've survived too. They had begun writing to one another in the spring of 1942. Her 26th letter to him was written at the start of March 1943, and it goes as follows. My dear child, don't worry about not hearing from us. We can't communicate any longer. We're trapped in ghettos, and we can't communicate with our relatives in the countryside. All I can say is that we're going through a critical period. We only have hope in God. One hopes so as not to lose reason. I try to be patient and philosophical about it as much as I can. We have all declared our assets and wealth. Our stores are closed. Always be grateful toward your 2 friends, please. They've shown themselves to be worthy. Kiss your cousins on our behalf and give them courage. Don't stay outside for too long so you don't catch cold. Father and I send you tender kisses, your mother, Sarina. P.S. If you ever need anything, your 2 friends will help you. Permit me to underline a few aspects of this extraordinary document that interest the historian. First, and to state the obvious, this is testimony to an intimacy, to the loving relationship between a mother and her son. Second, it's evidence of the importance of friendship and affection. It's a document that's written not in the formal language of the state, like those official slips of the Service for the Administration of Jewish Property that I looked at all those years ago, but in the language of letters. They wrote to each other in French, by the way, occasionally using a Greek, Turkish, Hebrew, or Judeo-Espanol word as needed. It was an effort to communicate at a time when the writers had been cut off from anything resembling normality. Movement was no longer possible to them. They couldn't any longer earn their living. Since the spring of 1942, the Germans, who were running the city with a Greek municipal administration at their disposal, had ratcheted up the pressure on the Jews of Thessaloniki, whose community formed such a historic part of the city. In July 42, they'd choreographed a kind of public humiliation of Jewish men, forcing them to stand for hours in a central square and perform gymnastics under the burning sun. Over the next few months, they used Jewish men for forced labor, and in December, the destruction of the ancient cemetery began. The planning for the deportations to Auschwitz began early in the new year, and a census and various restrictions quickly followed. At the end of February 1943, Jews were confined to certain districts and dismissed from professional organizations. In effect, they were being excised from the life of the town in the most brutal fashion. In the first days of March, a neighborhood near the railway station, the Baron Hirsch Quarter, was fenced off with barbed wire, and the Service for the Administration of Jewish Property was set up. The first convoy to Auschwitz would leave Thessaloniki on the 15th of March. Maurice would receive only 2 more letters from his mother. By 17th March, her nervousness and despair have increased, even though she tries to hide the worst of their situation from her son. And I quote, "My eyes are filled with tears, and my heart is filled with ice-cold terror," she writes to him. And this from a woman who loved life, enjoyed clothes and music, and had allowed herself to be photographed many years earlier on a stay in the spa town of Carlsbad, dancing in a white dress on a cafe table with a circle of friends gazing on, and her husband and son kneeling before her in mock homage. She tells her son how their movements have been gradually restricted, how they've been deprived of their possessions and even their pets. 2 days earlier, she writes, the first convoy had left, and I quote, "We don't know where to." They faced deportation, in her mind, to an unknown land, separated from their friends and family. I quote, "On the day of departure, people go crazy. They burn their paper money, destroy their furniture with the cries of mortally wounded animals." She tells him they're giving everything away. Maurice's aunt is about to give birth. His grandparents have to fend for themselves. His father is simply not much use. Quote, "It's as if I had another child and I treat him like one." Other people outside the family for her fall into 2 camps. She cannot praise Maurice's old friends highly enough, Faltsis and Triantafylidis. One, she writes him, has been, quote, "more than a son to me during this difficult period. I'll never be able to repay him for everything he did for us. I'll be a mother to him should God grant me the power to return one day." She tells Maurice he should live with his friends, quote, "like brothers." On the other hand, there are those who, quote, "like birds of prey come to devour what we leave behind and which could not be theirs with covetous eyes. These people are sweet-talking friends who wish to grab the bloody remains of our heart and abandon property with the nails of birds of prey." In short, this awful moment is a moment of truth in which people reveal their true nature. Only God remains inscrutable. She tries to understand why they're enduring such suffering, what they have done. She cannot find a reason. She tells him, God won't abandon us. He can perform a miracle at any time. Her final letter, which must have been smuggled out of the ghetto, was written on March the 21st. She's conscious this may be her last letter, and she's beset with emotions. Father, she writes, is completely discouraged. As for your friend, this is a reference to either Faltsis or Triantafylidis, quote, "You will never be able to repay him for what he's done to us. You must be more than a brother to him. You owe your life to him and to the other friend of yours who's by your side." Some weeks later, a last letter reaches Maurice in Athens. Unlike the others, it's written in Greek, and it comes from his uncle, Serina's brother, Zach, who tells him that nearly 3/4 of the Jews of the city have already been sent, quote, in an unknown direction. They say it's for Poland. Only young men kept for labor and some of their parents remain. Quote, unfortunately, with sadness, I let you know your father and mother were sent yesterday. That was the 24th of March. Zach remains with the grandparents and his wife who had just given birth and their 3 other children. But soon they too were deported and all of them were killed in Auschwitz. These letters form part of an important collection that was published in Greek and last year in English. They were edited by the historian Leon Saltiel, whose book on the Holocaust in Thessaloniki is itself a wonderful achievement. He'd been entrusted with them by the wife of Maurice Saltiel, who had recognized their importance, and just in time conducted his own research around them, able to have conversations with one of those dear friends, Sotiris Valtsis, who was still living in Thessaloniki in 2015 and passed away shortly after. Maurice Saltiel had himself been sheltered in Athens by these friends and managed to survive the war using a fake ID under the name Sotiriadis. He returned to his native city after the war, reopened his father's business, and became an important figure in Thessaloniki's post-war culture, flourishing before his death in 1998. These letters contain worlds within them, and I want to draw out only a few of what seem to me their most significant aspects. In the first place, there is the light that they shed on the plight of Greek Jews in the middle of the Holocaust in 1942-3. They didn't know what was planned for them. Their destination was unclear, but the treatment itself was terrifying and aroused fears of the worst. The speed with which things could change was an important feature of the situation. Policies succeeded one another with bewildering rapidity, and the whole effect was disorienting. The deportations from Thessaloniki, by far the largest community in the country, represented the start of the final solution in Greece, along with other deportations organized by the Bulgarian occupiers at about the same time from the towns of northeastern Greece. The following year, with Italy out of the war and Germany in complete control, the Jewish communities of other towns were targeted, from Ioannina to the Ionian Islands and, of course, Athens. The roundups in Crete and Rhodes followed in the summer of 1944, by which time the end of the occupation in Greece was only months away. In total, as we've heard, more than 80% of Greece's Jewish population was deported and killed, one of the highest percentages in Europe. The second thing I want to point out is that the letters are themselves important for what they represent. Letters, and indeed communication in general with the world beyond, became of critical importance to those caught up in the persecution, as they were across all strata of society during the war. Letters generated intense feelings, both the writing of them and the reading of them, and they often describe the writer's impatience to hear news or the writer's disappointment at being kept in the dark. Little has actually been written on the postal services in occupied Europe, which seem to have continued more smoothly in many areas, and certainly in Greece, than one might have expected. Some of these letters were sent through the post. Some use a kind of code to refer to sensitive events in case they're read by censors, but others quite open about what's happening. And many went by hand, entrusted to friends. Which raises a central question in the historiography, the precise nature of the relationship between the Greek Jews and their Christian neighbors and compatriots. Let me try to summarize something like this, a contentious area of discussion in which there's simply no unanimity. On the one hand, anti-Semitism as a cultural attitude was pervasive in Greece, as it was virtually everywhere in Europe. It was picked up from ethnic stereotypes in popular culture, and it was undergirded by popular understandings of church teachings. Anti-Semitism was not, however, a matter of state policy before the war, and it didn't affect everyday relations in the way that it did, say, in Poland or even France. Everywhere was different, of course. In the case of Thessaloniki in particular, the passage from Ottoman to Greek rule had required a difficult period of readjustment, both for the city's Jewish community and for its new Greek governors. But the letters from Serina to Maurice indicate quite clearly to us that in the interwar years, a kind of symbiosis, a new kind of middle-class sociability had brought together Jewish and Christian families through schools and clubs and work to the point where two of Maurice's closest friends were his Christian classmates, Faltsis and Triantafyllides. At the same time, and on the other hand, the opportunities created by the wartime expropriation of Jewish properties and assets in the town unleashed, as in so many places, a kind of amoral scramble in which some Christian individuals and groups sought to profit. The archives of the Service for the Administration of Jewish Properties confirm the picture painted in Serina's letters to Maurice. They contain dozens, if not hundreds, of requests by all kinds of people from the town to be granted the right to manage Jewish properties and businesses, almost all of them typed out on the special forms that the service had created for the purpose. For both these groups of Greek Christians, those who helped and those who profited, what was happening to the Jews was on such a scale and so much in their midst, it was impossible not to see it. Many Greek Christian families continued to live unhindered in their movements in the same zones which had been designated by the occupiers for the Jews to move into. In that sense, ghetto is a misnomer. And one reason for this correspondence existing is it was possible for Serina Saltiel to give her letters to her Christian friends to send away on her behalf. But for me, the most compelling aspect of these letters is that they open up for us a basic area of life that's usually fairly inaccessible to historians. I mean by this that what we see in these letters is a world in which women are central, adult men are sidelined, and children are the hope for the future. It's a world of dreams and wishes, fears and anguish. In other words, a kind of testimony to a history of intimate human relationships. The letters give us a history that's far removed from that which describes the men in power behind their desks or behind their guns, determining policies and carrying out their wishes. Of course, professional history has moved far from an older conception in which important events are by definition public and the important protagonists are invariably male. Nevertheless, an approach to history which turns this on its head, in which it's women and children who are the decision makers, remains precious and unusual, if only because the historical traces of women's and children's lives and feelings are in general less plentiful and accessible than men's. Letters such as the ones I quoted allow us into a domain normally privileged for writers and artists to sketch out the world of human sentiments, and to do so not on the basis of imagination, but on the basis of reality. They show their authors struggling to keep the basic structure of family together in circumstances of unimaginable difficulty and tension. They are nothing if not records of life in extremis. They show the psychic effort required to keep contact with some semblance of normality, to preserve something of one's peacetime role as a mother or a son. They preserve a world in which words matter. Serina is always correcting her son's French and telling him to work harder at it, because they allow for that mutual understanding and contact which the occupier seems pledged to destroy. And they bring us closer to figures from long ago, to a world we struggle to comprehend. Or perhaps it's not so far in the past, after all, and not so difficult to understand. One of the reasons behind the idea of commemorating the Holocaust is that it should act as a kind of moral warning from history and help us avoid repetition. It's a tragic irony, I think, that Russia has launched a war using the spectre of Nazism as a pretext, that fighting should be raging today around some of the key sites of the Holocaust, and that once again families are being sundered and living in terror. Remembering the suffering of the Jews can lead us in many directions. It can make us lament the enormous loss, not only to the community of Greek Jewry itself, but to the country they form part of. It can make us sensitive to how fast things can change for the worse, how human resourcefulness can sometimes not be enough in the face of overwhelming odds. And it can make us conscious of all that we've learned since the Second World War ended and Nazism was wiped out, and ready to move fast to defend this knowledge. History is the past in the present. It is itself part of life, and it's impossible to imagine life without it. In looking back, we also decide who we are and how we want to act. Thank you.
The Atelier d'Excellence is comprised of 3 talented musicians. Maria Zoe, mezzo-soprano, Mary Pinto, piano, and Paloma Ferrante, cello.
Ein Unglück
I want to thank Ms. Nancy Papaioannou of the Atlantic Bank for hosting the reception that follows. Special thanks as well to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and to Evelyn Canelea of the Greek Consulate. Allow me to thank you as well, ladies and gentlemen, for attending tonight's program. Your presence speaks directly to why it's important to remember the Holocaust. As the years go by and the Holocaust recedes further and further back in time, discrimination, violent extremism, hate speech remain current, and they pose challenges to our values. Remembering the Holocaust reminds us of the terrible cost of intolerance. It helps us focus on the importance of strengthening our resilience against falsehoods and anti-Semitic discourse. It vividly reminds us of the dangers of silence and forces us to think of the consequences. It helps us understand that being a bystander is being an enabler, that neutrality is anything but neutral. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and good night.